Next on the 9 o'clock movie, the television premiere of Star Trek, The Next Generation.
Greetings and felicitations.
Hip hip hurrah, tally-ho.
Hey, baby doll.
Hey, Puddin'.
Star Trek The Next Generation. I mean, this is a series that's near and dear to our hearts. We're not going to go directly into the premiere episode, the 2-hour pilot, Encounter at Farpoint. Instead, let's just talk about what built up to this. We know that it's been some time since Star Trek's been on the airwaves. So, what was your experience, your first experience? Do you remember hearing that Star Trek was going to come back, not in an animated form like it was in the 70s, but to live action?
I think the first time I heard about it was reading in Starlog. And it was pretty exciting and scary too, because you wonder, like, is it going to be any good? But, yeah, and and then after they decided that it wasn't going to have any of the original cast, and then you're like, oh, gee, I don't know. But I understand, because making the movies through the 80s, and everyone talked about how much older the actors were getting, and it was about time to get some younger actors and make a new Star Trek. I mean, we would rather see a new Star Trek than nothing at all.
That's right. And it's been said so many years that Gene Roddenberry said he caught lightning in a bottle.
Yes.
With that cast. I mean, that cast, if any one person was changed, let's say even someone like Uhura, Scotty, we're not talking about the big three. If you took about any of those, what within time they would call the Magnificent Seven, if you took some of those away, one or two of them away, it really would be a different dynamic. And a lot of fans were hesitant, especially older fans. I know myself and my brother, we were excited. We didn't waver in thinking that it was going to be bad. We had confidence. We heard that Gene Roddenberry was involved, and pretty much if he touched it, it was gold. That's what we viewed. We went to a Star Trek convention at the Park Plaza Hotel, New Haven, Connecticut, and it was before the show came out, and they were giving us slides, a slide presentation of who was involved and how Gene was very adamant of moving the Star Trek story forward, and it would not be something, at this time I didn't understand it. They said they weren't going to go by the limitations of networks because it was going to be syndicated. And it's something that's going to be totally new because they could tell the stories that they've always wanted to tell in Star Trek, but couldn't.
They didn't have to be censored by the network, because I think Gene really clashed with the network a lot of times on the original series. And he said since the original actually got popular while it was in syndication, then maybe syndication would be the way to go with The Next Generation.
And I didn't know this at the time, but this was something that just wasn't done. Creating a show that wasn't in syndication and hoping that it was going to be a big hit. I mean, we're TV guide collectors, and when we look at the 1987 fall previews, it doesn't list Star Trek The Next Generation. Like, even mass media ignored it in so many ways.
Because they only had the network shows.
Only network shows on there. Network and cable.
Yes.
So it's curious when we look back through media, that being Time magazines, People magazines, things of that sort, anything outside of Starlog. You know, Starlog had its hand on the pulse the entire time. And Star Trek, Starlog kept us up to date. But there was some hesitation of, really, could a show that was not associated with a network, could it go anywhere?
The Next Generation really put syndication on the map. I mean, after it was a hit, then a lot of other studios were producing syndicated shows. So I mean, you know, TNG proved that it can be a hit in syndication.
And that's one of the reasons why when you talk to people and you say, what was it like to watch it immediately? Different parts of the country aired it at different times, different days. It was whatever their local affiliate wanted to put it in. There wasn't a nationwide standard. Now, there was some curiosities about this show that was coming up around the rumor mill. Gene was taking all these ideas that he had in the past, and he desperately wanted to show everyone that this show was going to be different. This is the things that I want to do. Having a female security officer. That's something that he wanted. He wanted more representation and equality for women in Starfleet on the screen. We know that there's a lot going on different decks, in different areas. We know that there have been female admirals, but Gene wanted this on the forefront, even with the personnel, how people looked, how people acted.
He repeated some characters, like, you know how Riker and Troy were actually Decker and Ilea from the motion picture.
That's right.
That, you know, the handsome guy and the beautiful woman, and she was this beautiful exotic woman from another species, and they had a past together before they came together on the Enterprise. So things like that, because it was such a good idea, he wanted to use it again.
Yes. He also wanted to carry over some of the personnel that really made Star Trek what it is, especially Dorothy Fontana.
That's right. He had Dorothy Fontana and David Gerrold that both worked for him on the original series. And this time David Gerrold got to be a staff writer because he wasn't before.
He did work, both of them did work for not only the original series, but the animated series. So they were involved in Trek through numerous iterations. I love the fact that they wanted to stay true to the Enterprise of what it was originally, but we know that the refit looked a little bit different, and they thought, okay, how about some years later, how many iterations would the Enterprise go through where the fourth refit, or the fifth refit, depending on how you want to count it, would be markedly different. In order to do that, they had to get some staff that were excited about this, and I will say it, yes, they were fans. Mike Okuda, Rick Sternbach, I mean, they set the stage of what the aesthetics of the Enterprise would look like.
And I thought it was beautiful, and it was also recognizable. You could tell it was based on the original Enterprise, but it was still sleeker. I mean, you could tell that it was more modern, and it was, updated for the time that it was made in, and it was more detailed. You could see all the it looked like tiles on it, and all the different parts where there were lights, and different lights would be on at different times. It was really cool looking.
Yes, and also the fact they were going to keep so much of the original series tools, like the phaser, the tricorder, the communicator, but they would give it some updates. And to me, one of the most shocking updates was to make the communicator on the person.
Yeah, I don't know how they came up with that idea, but it was pretty neat. All you do was just touch it and start talking.
It totally made sense. From what I understand, this was the next progression because in the motion picture, the communicators were on their wrists.
Yes.
They went back in Star Trek II and had the flip communicator because that's what audiences were used to. But they thought, and they said, wait a second, the next step of progression will be on the person. And so it's become a standard going forward.
And I like it, just the idea that they don't have to reach for the communicator anymore. They don't have to pull it out off of where it was stuck to their belt on the original series. So yeah, now it's just there all the time, unless it falls off.
Yes, and these are all things that were, well, they had some familiarity, but they were shockingly different. And I know quite a few fans were just overwhelmed with how shockingly different things were. Like I said, at that convention that I was at, I never heard one person say, this is going to be horrible. I don't want to watch it. There's too many changes.
Oh, no one said that?
You got to figure, at that time, I was only 13 years old, 14 years old. So I wasn't talking to people that would be our age now. So I have to say, I didn't hear anything out loud, when Susan Sackett was there presenting all these ideas, there were all cheers. It was applause. People were positive. People were happy. And so every once in a while you'll see some articles and they erroneously don't note which newspaper it's from, but we found out they're from the National Enquirer. That's not a reputable newspaper. But things like Star Trek fans hate new Trek, things of that sort. We even look at some of the Starlog magazines, look at the letter columns, and you're saying, by and large, people were excited. Yeah, there is some hesitation on some of these changes, but once the ball got rolling, fans jumped on and said, yeah, Gene has not lost his magic touch.
And because he did a lot of things that, like I said, that he wanted to do before, but also he hired some good writers, and all of these creative people behind the scenes, as you said, were people who like Star Trek. So
they were fans, yeah, and they will admit it.
Helped,
we've seen Rick Sternbach many times, and he'll come around and say, "Yes, I am a Star Trek fan. I desperately wanted to work on this series." Yeah, of course, that was the idea. People who love Star Trek will put their heart and soul and passion into it. One thing that did throw me off is the color of the uniforms, because I was so trained outside of the movies. That is, I was so trained of the traditional colors: gold for command, blue for science, and red for ship services. Did that throw you off a bit, seeing now red or burgundy as command?
Yeah, it did. Changing the colors, like, I'm not even sure why they did that, but I guess
heard they did it because red looked better on Patrick Stewart.
That's what I'm thinking. It's red is a bolder color, and yeah, all the people look better in red than yellow.
I remember one of the fan theories that was floating around at that time was, well, this is coming right after the Monster Maroons. So the Monster Maroon, the next progression, if they were to go back to color-specific uniforms, were to keep maroon for captains.
Because everyone has gotten used to Kirk in the movies wearing that Monster Maroon. And,
yes.
Yeah, and it looks good on him, and you kind of think of it as a command color, too, because it's just it's so bold, and it seems to embody that.
Absolutely.
Now, one thing I can say about the uniforms, I really didn't like the design at first. The way it was asymmetrical.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it just doesn't make sense. Like, why would they do it that way? Why would they have the little point thing on one side and that sharp angle at the bottom?
Mm-hmm.
But I got used to it later. I mean, like, now I couldn't imagine it in any other way. But at first it really seemed strange.
What other feelings did you have even before watching the show with regards to all this information that Starlog gave us?
It was neat because, David Gerald was the one writing the TNG report in Starlog. So, and, I remember him giving details about the characters, and when he talked about Data, and Data was a special character. He's the one that's examining humanity from the outside. I was still a little skeptical. I was like, yeah, I mean, it sounds good, but you really don't know until you see the show how good it's going to be.
See, that's what I was going to say. Like, if we were neighbors, if we went to school together, we would have had arguments on the bus all the time. Because all I was doing was getting excited over every single thing that I was seeing, and you were like, I don't know about this.
Yeah. Well, David Gerald said he wrote that scene that had Picard and Riker and the pilot where Picard brings up the thing in Riker's record where he didn't let the captain beam down to a planet. Mm-hmm. And I know that was David Gerald's idea because it was even in his book that the world of Star Trek.
He was saying that for years, how illogical it is to put a captain.
The captain wouldn't put himself in danger.
No branch
like
of military would ever do that.
So that was interesting, and I thought that was a neat idea. And the way he let the captain and first officer argue like that, and it still came out that the captain admired the first officer for saying what his real feelings were about it.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's talk about how they put this crew together. This was a time that was another thing that was different. The focus wasn't going to be on one or two personnel or even three, but it truly would be an ensemble cast, and we were aware of that early on.
Even though they said they would try to have more development for Picard, Riker, and Data, but they did want it to be an ensemble. They did want to have, at least an episode focusing on each of the main characters.
All right, so let's talk about Captain Picard, Patrick Stewart. Now, sci-fi fans were already familiar with Patrick Stewart from his work on Dune.
And yeah, that was another strange thing, like having this old bald man as the captain.
I remember having a friend when we made the discussion saying, he kept saying, well, I love the original. At that time, we once Next Generation came around, we called it Old Star Trek. The idea of TOS didn't come till years later. So when you said I'm watching Star Trek, you had to say, am I watching Next Generation or New Trek, or are you watching Old Trek, right?
Right, yes.
I think a little bit later on, maybe in the early 90s, the term was Classic Star Trek.
Yeah, some people called it classic Trek, yeah, and some people called it original.
Yeah,
the original.
It was going to be some time before we referred to it as the original series or TOS. But I remember saying, well, William Shatner's just getting too old. And this guy just flipped out. He goes, too old? Look at Patrick Stewart. He's got to be older. And they're like, nope, he's not. Love the casting, though. I thought the idea of having someone French, I never questioned it at the time why he had an English accent, but his ancestry was in France. I didn't question it. I think if I watched the show, like, if I was the age now, as I'm watching Discovery or Lower Deck, something like that, I'm just more aware of things than when I was 13, 14 years old. I'm a lot more analytical now. Did that ever come up in your mind, why we have a Frenchman with an English accent?
No, I never thought about it. I knew Patrick Stewart was British. And the thing is that when he talked, he didn't really have a strong accent. I think he spoke, normal most of the time, even though there were certain words that he said different, like issue instead of issue and things like that.
Schedule.
Yes, a few things he said differently, but for the most part, I didn't see him as really having an accent. And I didn't really, even though his name was French, I really just thought of him, more as just being the captain than anything else.
Mm-hmm. Love the casting. Jonathan Frakes, a former Captain America.
Oh, that makes it sound like he won a beauty contest.
Well,
but you mean the superhero Captain America?
I remember going to malls as a kid. My mother still has pictures. You would go to a mall and they'd say, appearing now, Darth Vader, appearing this weekend, Spider-Man. And you'd go to the mall and they'd have some promotional where you'd go and meet superheroes and science fiction characters. And that's what he used to do. He used to be a mall superhero for hire. He was Captain America.
And when you think about it, it sounds pretty cool.
Yeah.
I'm sure the only reason he did it is because it was a job.
It's a paycheck. That's
probably
all it was.
It wasn't probably what he preferred to do at the time, but
of course. But what'd you think about his casting?
He was good. I liked him in the part.
He was supposed to be the Captain Kirk of the show. They wanted to deviate.
Yeah.
They did not want the captain to be the ladies' man. That was one of the things that was clear in the writer's Bible. At this point, they wanted to make sure the writer's Bible that they had established backgrounds for the characters. TOS, they were making it up as they went along. This was going to be different now with TNG. He was going to be from Alaska, too.
Yes. They established that, someone observed that Kirk, so what they did was they split Kirk into two people, Picard and Riker. So, because Picard had he was the captain, the commander, but Riker was the handsome one and the one who was the ladies' man.
The charmer.
Yes, but also a good officer.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I can't say that Riker really stood out for me much in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I did think he was a good character, and I did like him with Deanna, and even in the first season, you're wondering if they will ever get together.
I think that was wonderful how they took that archetype for Decker and Ilea, transplanted it in Next Generation, so you had someone with a background. I think it's wonderful to start a series with knowing that people do have lives beforehand, and we're probably going to find out more about it as the show develops. And
since this show went on 7 seasons, they had a lot more character development than the original that only had 3 seasons. And so Denise Crosby and Marina Sirtis, they were playing opposite parts to begin with.
I can't imagine Marina Sirtis as a security officer.
That is strange. She's not as tall. That's what would be weird about it.
Well, that was the point. They originally wanted to have a Hispanic woman as a security officer because Gene Roddenberry saw Aliens, and he said, this is, he looked at Aliens was an amazing, or at the time it was, did they have Aliens then? I think it was just Alien.
The first one.
It was the first one, Alien, yes. But the fact of the matter, Gene wanted ethnic diversity, which is the hallmark of Star Trek.
Yes.
And so he had the idea of having a Hispanic woman as the security officer. But his inspiration was the Alien movie. He picked Marina Sirtis. She's British, but Greek ancestry.
Yeah, it does seem like it would have been really different if she had been security
It's one of those things that I'd be curious to see the test footage, if there was any.
Yeah, it would have been interesting.
Would have been very different, because we've just grown to love both of those characters in their roles. We can't imagine them doing anything else.
Right, I think Tasha turned out to be a good security officer, even though she didn't last long.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, Marina Sirtis, excellent casting there. Let's talk about Tasha Yar. She's one, actually, that has some family history in motion pictures.
She's related to Bing Crosby. She's his granddaughter. And also, she's related to Mary Crosby, who was on Dallas. So, yeah, she's got a famous family. And even though she, had a short term on the Next Gen as Tasha Yar, I mean, at least she made some other appearances. She got to come back as Tasha and as the Romulan Sela. And Denise turned out to be a fan favorite, really.
LeVar Burton as Geordie LaForge.
He was an interesting character. I think he was almost the everyman character like O'Brien. Geordie was more the...
He was so relatable.
Yeah. More the common man.
Because he's an average person. He had girl problems, things like that.
Even though he was a brilliant engineer.
Oh, and look, in real world, he's strikingly handsome. He's not a guy that's going to have girl problems.
Right. but having the visor is a little different. I mean, LeVar Burton has beautiful eyes.
Yes.
And that's one thing they said they kind of regretted was covering up his eyes because they looked so good.
Well, that's one of the things that Gene wanted to express. Now, this is one of the problems. It's going to be down the road till we discuss this. One of the problems I have with Deep Space Nine is that they originally wanted to have more representation for someone that was handicapped. But that was Gene's idea for this character is, okay, you're blind. Technology going forward a couple hundred years from now, you won't have perfect vision, but we will be able to do something to simulate the vision experience. And so he thought the best thing that he could show that handicapped people can acclimate to any job is to have a blind person pilot the ship. That was one of those subliminal things that Star Trek put in with regards to inclusion and diversity.
It was a great idea, and the character was even modeled after a person who is blind.
That's right. It
And
was in tribute to a fan.
Yes, and they put Geordie at the helm. That originally he was there, piloting the ship, and that was Gene's idea, which was a great idea. The irony of a blind man piloting the ship. But then in the second season, he got moved to engineering, which was, it was also a good idea too. It's just that no longer having the blind pilot, oh well. But he really got to show off more of his talent in engineering and being the chief engineer. And since the show couldn't settle on a chief engineer during the first season, once Geordie became the chief engineer, at least they let him stay there in that position.
And I like the fact because it showed growth. The characters were not stagnating in the Next Generation. They were moving up in rank. They were moving around departmentally. It totally made sense.
We got to see a few changes, even though, well, they most of the time they grew in their own position. But we did but there was a lot of character development throughout the 7 seasons.
He also had some background in Reading Rainbow and in Roots. Guess what? Never saw any of those shows before Next Generation. So my first exposure to him was in TNG.
Yeah, mine too. But it was something they said that they were taking a chance by hiring someone who was not an unknown. I think it was him and Will Wheaton were the two that had already made a name for themselves before this show.
Okay, now this next one, she did make a name for herself, but not so much in front of the camera. Gates McFadden.
She had done Labyrinth as a choreographer for the puppets. And yeah, that's great. I mean, she had already been a dancer and choreographer, and so playing the Doctor on this show was pretty cool. I mean, because she actually was an actor too. And I know Gates McFadden said that she actually wanted to do comedy, and she took the part because she thought the Doctor was funny at first because she read the script for The Naked Now. And in that one was more of a comedy. So somehow she took the part based on that, but then it turned out that the Doctor wasn't that funny.
Now, we have to say, up to this point, virtually none of the actors either knew about Star Trek or were particularly fans of Star Trek. That's going to be different with this next actor, Wil Wheaton.
Yes, so he had been on Stand By Me when he was younger, and of course, and he was still a child when he was on this show. And he's apparently a big geek. I mean, of course, now we know, like, he's into gaming a lot. But yeah, he was a big geek back then, and he loved Star Trek, and he loved, like, the chance to meet William Shatner while he was working on Star Trek.
We're both the same age, so I remember when the show came on, I wasn't particularly a fan of any shows with kids on it. I mean, that's just how I was growing up. Even when I was much younger, I liked shows with adults on it. I thought that was weird. Not so much the casting was weird, but the choice to put a kid on the bridge. I could see being on the ship, his mother's a doctor, but beyond that, I wasn't thrilled with it. But Gene Roddenberry insisted on this part because he felt that this is where he would be in the future, because he was very minded on doing more things, doing non-kid stuff. Guess what? I'm the exact opposite of Gene Roddenberry. What did you think about the part of Wesley Crusher on the ship?
Well, I didn't hate it, but yeah, kind of like you. It's not like I'm going to be drawn to a character just because he's a kid and because, well, of course, at that time I was 18, but yeah, I wasn't really drawn to kids shows with kids when I was a kid. But I one thing I remember reading in Starlog, David Gerrold's report, originally the character was supposed to be a girl named Leslie.
That's right.
And the thing is, because I remember, like, David Gerrold's article, the whole article, it talked about all the different characters, and it mentioned Leslie, and then it was just a little sentence right at the end of the article. He said, well, they just made a change. Leslie is now a boy named Wesley. And the thing is, everybody knows, right, that Wesley was based on Gene Roddenberry himself, and that Gene's middle name was Wesley.
Yes.
But if that's the case, I mean, if the character was going to be a girl at first, was the girl originally based on Gene, or what?
And that's one of those things that I'm seeing. I don't want to say conflicting information, but I'm seeing, well, yeah, conflicting information. I think that they were just tossing around so many ideas at that time.
Yeah, it must have been. So, yeah, who knows what really happened? It might have been.
Or the order of how things happened.
Yeah, David Gerrold might have just heard it was going to be Leslie and missed the meeting where they said it was going to be Wesley or something.
But that was the idea, was even though Gene said he wanted a character based on himself when he was a youth, there was the idea of that, well, girls could do anything that boys can do. Let's put a girl in this situation.
Okay.
Which, okay, I mean, you're proving that fact with Tasha Yar being head of security. I don't know. It's one of those things, and we didn't have executives of CBS breathing down their throats this time, so who knows what exactly happened. But we got Wesley. Now, the curious thing is that an actor and a character has been so beloved throughout the decades, and now has the record of being on more Star Trek episodes than any other actor. This character was the last one cast of the main cast, and possibly might not have even made it into the show, that being Michael Dorn as Lieutenant Worf. Yeah,
they had already cast the show, and he wasn't part of the cast, and then they decided to add a Klingon. They decided to... Yeah, it seems like, because I thought I also read this in Starlog, they weren't going to have Klingons at first, because they just wanted to do different things and not depend on what they had already done. But then they decided to have a Klingon as a Starfleet officer to show that, you know, this is how we've progressed. We've made peace with the Klingons now.
Yes.
So it was a good idea. Oh, and I think they also wanted to add more conflict, because that was one of the things, especially after Gene died, was to make sure they had conflict on the show. So Worf was a character who was more likely to argue with people because he wanted to do things the Klingon way.
That's right. Star Trek has, up until this point, I don't want to say always, because this is the second live-action series, but Mr. Spock was known as the outsider, the one that didn't exactly fit in so many ways. Now with Next Generation, you have a couple of characters that can be deemed the outsider, especially a Klingon, the only Klingon in all of Starfleet.
Definitely unique.
Absolutely.
But they made his character one that had been raised by humans.
We didn't know that at the time, though.
Right, yeah.
We knew nothing about his background.
But I think they had to fit that in just because it made people understand why he could get along with humans as well as he did.
Now, being a comic book fan, I was reading since issue 1, the DC comic book series that came out shortly after Wrath of Khan. And in those comics, they added a Klingon on the crew of the original series. And the idea was that this was the next step in proving that humanity can get not along with each other of different races and of different nationalities, but we can get along with different species. Yes, in the comic book series, they have Andorians as part of the crew and a host of others. But they took the jump of saying a Klingon, that this would be the ultimate test. And even though the Klingon character was more of a pacifist, it was very different than Worf, that seed was planted years beforehand.
Yeah, the comics had the idea first.
When Worf came into the picture, I think it was in Starlog that Gene said in an interview that we have a Cold War going on, and this is going to prove if humans and Klingons can work together, then Americans and Russians can work together. So it was one of those social issues that was very subtle, but it made you think of, can people of various backgrounds really work things out to the point of having a common goal?
A brilliant idea for the time. And, on the original, Spock was the only non-human who served regularly on the ship.
Yes.
And now we've got on the Next Generation, you've got Deanna Troi, the Beta Z, even,
and you have Data.
Z, and
He's
Data.
not human. And Worf. So we're seeing the multiple species or bodies working together on the main bridge, not just the background, but the main bridge.
Right, and then later on we find out that there were other aliens too that were on the ship.
And you did make a point of saying the original series had Spock, by far the most popular character. To this day, he's the face of the franchise. Gene wanted to make sure in this series that we would not bring back old species. He said, we do not want Vulcans to be front and center. And that's why, even though as popular as Vulcans were, he wanted to make sure that this crew stood on its own. What did you think about that decision?
It was a good idea. No, when I first heard it, I can't say I really liked the idea.
Yeah.
At first I thought, I think I'd like to see a Vulcan. But the thing is, they did make the show stand on its own, and it still turned out to be a good show. And even, and especially with the Klingons, because they hadn't been developed as much before, and it was great to see so much with the Klingons having, even in the first season they had a Klingon episode, and then later the second season they had, so they kept examining them, and then getting into more about Worf's family with the Klingons. The whole Klingon storyline on TNG was great.
Now, we're fans of both the books and the Fossa series. And because this was super popular in the 80s, those of us who followed these knew that there's different theories of why the Klingons looked the way they did in not only the movies, but in Next Generation versus the original series Klingons, ridges or no ridges. And so the Fossa books say, well, they had some work done on them. They were hybrids. Also, John F. Ford brought out some of these ideas as well in the novels, yet the Next Generation did not even want to address it. They didn't want to talk about it. It took some time before this issue came up. Do you remember anything in fandom during that time where there was either love or hate or indifference or any discussion about it?
Not really. I think people liked the Klingons on the Next Generation. Remember that the early 90s was the era when Klingons were so popular.
Huge.
Yeah, the Klingon Assault Group was formed, and you saw all of these Klingons at cons. And it would be the TNG Klingons that had the ridges and wore the silver and black uniforms.
Mm-hmm.
So everyone really loved it. They loved being Klingons. They loved watching the Klingons. So there was, I don't remember really hearing anything about hatred for them.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as like explanations, I think I heard like the ones with the ridges were called the Imperial Klingons.
That came out of the Fossa books.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, the Fossa manuals, it was an official Star Trek product, but they went off and explained all the things that were not explained on the shows.
Which is what a lot of the novels did.
Absolutely, and that's what we relied on. We didn't have to have a show to explain it because we were keeping up with what was going on in the fringes of the Star Trek universe. I think that was an exciting time, especially for that era. And when I would go to Star Trek conventions, I could have deep discussions with people about things like that. And you kind of judged your fandom of how much you knew about, well, you reading this book? Are you following this? Or are you just watching the show? Oh, you're just watching the show? You're a passive fan. I mean, to be a Star Trek fan during that time period with no internet, Starlog and conventions were our lifeline.
Yes, and reading books and reading things like Best of Trek that filled in some of those things. And,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Keeping in touch with fandom.
So we also heard Gene Roddenberry say that the way the Klingons look on TNG is the way he always wanted them to look. Again, it was another budget thing. They just couldn't do that on the original series. Oh, but of course the motion picture was really the first appearance of the speed bumps with the Klingons.
Yes, Mark Leonard.
Yes.
Yep, no doubt about it.
And it wasn't until Enterprise when they gave the in-universe explanation for the Klingons and how they changed.
Yeah. But with regard to this initial era, it was, overall, people were excited about it. Art, before we go into our group discussion of the episode, now we did watch this with some friends. We have monthly meetups at our house and monthly viewings. Let's look at what TV Guide, cover date September 26th through October 2nd, 1987, has to say about this episode. Now, we already discussed that this was not even mentioned in the TV Guide fall preview. Throughout this issue, there are no advertisements for Star Trek. Now we have the original 66 TV Guide, and there were actually blurbs and advertisements and commentary about this new show called Star Trek. You figured there would be a lot of fervor in this issue of TV Guide about this new series. What do we get?
Nothing.
Nothing at all. We just get the standard listing. I'm really surprised that no one realized. I mean, to say this hit the world by storm is an understatement, because there is nothing promoting this show. Nothing at all. But let's see what the blurb says.
Debut. Set in the 24th century, 85 years after the original Star Trek voyage, this series follows Captain Jean-Luc Picard, Patrick Stewart, and the crew of the new Starship Enterprise as they take up the challenge to boldly go where no man has gone before. First up, the explorers are en route to the Farpoint station on the planet Deneb 4 when they are apprehended by the alien life form Q. Commander William Riker, Jonathan Frakes, Lieutenant Geordie LaForge, LeVar Burton, Lieutenant Tasha Yar, Denise Crosby, Deanna Troy, Marina Sirtis.
The following special presentation is brought to you in full stereo sound. Tonight on the 9 o'clock movie, the television premiere of Star Trek, The Next Generation.
Tonight, the 24th century begins.
Welcome to the Enterprise.
In a special world premiere movie, Star Trek, The Next Generation.
Ready for departure, sir. Engage.
78 years have passed since the days of the original USS Enterprise. Now a new Galaxy starship has been designed with a new team of highly skilled Federation explorers. Starfleet Captain Jean-Luc Picard, Commander Riker, Executive Officer, Chief Medical Officer Crusher, and her brilliant son, Wesley, Lieutenant Commander Data, an android, the telepathic Troy, Geordi, a man with unique vision, Security Officer Yar, and Klingon Officer Worf.
Shields and deflectors up, sir.
Go to yellow alert.
Their first mission, investigate a new star base on planet Deneb 4.
Thou art directed to return to thine own solar system immediately.
A hostile alien threatens the crew.
Now go back, or thou shalt most certainly die.
But they're determined to finish their mission.
I have photon torpedoes. Place them on ready status.
Hostile is now beginning to overtake us, sir.
Together, they stand trial before a merciless court.
You will now answer to the charge of being a grievously savage race.
Now, they have 24 hours to uncover the secrets of a strange world.
They're firing on Farpoint, sir.
The classic legend begins an all-new adventure.
Let's see what's out there.
Star Trek, The Next Generation.
Let's listen in on what some of our friends thought about rewatching this episode. All right, this is Nayar, and I remember distinctly being so excited watching this episode with my brother. We were pumped up to have our own Star Trek, a Star Trek that we could watch episodes where my father wouldn't interject and say, you know what's going to happen in this episode? Because it was new to everyone. And I thought it was amazing at the time because Dorothy Fontana was involved, as well as Gene Roddenberry. So we were bringing people from the old Trek back in, but it's still new Trek. There were nuances of new Trek that was carrying over, but it was so refreshing. And watching this episode over 30 years later, it still holds up. It still feels like Trek, even though we know what happened to all the characters. I've watched this episode more than any other Star Trek episode because it's when our family first got a VCR, and so we just kept watching this over and over and over again, and I never get tired of it.
I'm Zach, and I can't tell you when I first saw Farpoint Station. It's been a long time. I find it very interesting every time I watch this to just kind of reacquaint myself with the introduction of the Enterprise and how they introduce the crew and how those relationships are initially approached. Some of the moments are funny to me, like when Commander Riker says, "I'll see you on the station," and he gives a very weird look that I never noticed before until now. That just the glare he gives him on Farpoint Station when he says that the first time, it was kind of, yeah. So it's just neat for me to see it every time I watch it. I see something different that just kind of adds to the experience, and I guess that'll never get old. I hope it never gets old.
Trek, yeah.
That's the way it is. And I'm also glad to see some of the things that were in the episode evolve over time, because some of the things needed to be evolved out. I remember the first time I saw Farpoint Station, and how nice the computer was to Riker when he was looking for data. It was the only time the computer was ever that nice to someone in the hallways or in basic communication. It was kind of funny to see that, but it never happens again. So it kind of sticks out to me. It's never happened before in any of the previous Star Treks. And to see how the relationships begin and to know where they end up now, it's just kind of neat to go over that. Anyway.
So my name is Paul. I probably watched this for the first time a bit over a decade ago. It was my first bit of Trek to watch. So at the time, I was just really blown away by how many different ideas they were willing to throw into one episode. Obviously, not everything stayed with it, but just the fact that you had a show with such a breadth of ideas and characters that we would, eventually come to know so much better was really interesting to me. And, all of that wrapped around what ended up being a pretty fun mystery is also really nice. I'd say watching it now, the thing that strikes me is, I don't know if you've ever read any of the novelizations But I remember reading one called Ghost Ship, which I think was written based off of like the initial character ideas. I don't think it was written before the show actually aired.
Yeah, I think that's the number one. Isn't
Yeah.
that the first book?
Yeah.
Of the numbered books? Yeah.
And so I remember I read that at some point after finishing The Next Generation because I wanted more.
Yeah.
And reading that and just saying, like, these characters are so different from the show. Like, how did they get it so wrong? Riker is mistrustful of Data. Picard's just kind of a jackass. But watching this now, it's like, well, I could kind of see where an author who hadn't had the advantage of seeing the show could think those things, just based off the script. Like, obviously, some of the delivery makes it a bit different, but it was really interesting to see again this time. So.
Yeah.
This is Kavora, and I know when I watched it, I saw it when it premiered back in '87, and I watched it alone. I didn't know anybody else to watch it with me, and I had been looking forward to it. I grew up a fan of the original series, and for Next Gen, I read Starlog magazine. I know they had articles on it because David Gerald did a report every month. He was one of the staff writers for this, and. So I had been looking forward to it, but I was kind of leery of it. I was scared of, like, is it going to be good, And I really thought it was kind of mediocre when I first viewed it. It wasn't that bad, but it wasn't really that good either. But the show really came along a long way. I mean, it really grew to be great. And I know that John Delancey that played Q, he was the only actor at that time that I already knew. He was on Days of Our Lives, which I was a fan of, and it was because of his part on Days of Our Lives that he got the part on Star Trek, which was interesting. But at least I knew him, and I thought the character of Q was pretty good, and of course Q evolved later. I remember thinking the uniforms were kind of silly looking. I didn't really like that, the asymmetrical look on the front. I thought, like what are they doing? Like, why would they have that, And the story was okay, but but they actually improved the writing a lot later on. And, so it wasn't like so bad that I didn't want to see it again. So it was okay. And I have to say, like, I had no idea back then how much I would grow to love Picard. Mm-hmm. He's not really as likable in this episode. Yeah. I mean, later Picard just grew to be such a great character, and in this, you don't see that he's really going to become that good. You probably think maybe Riker would be better, but the way they wrote Picard later on, and of course Patrick Stewart's acting, he just really became, so iconic, and of course he got his own show.
Yeah, when we look at, you mentioned Starlog magazine. In fact, it took a decade for it to happen. Starlog initially wanted to be a Star Trek magazine, but they couldn't afford to make it a Star Trek magazine to get the rights from the studio. And so it took some time. They ended up being a general sci-fi magazine. But finally, in 1987, Starlog Press produced Star Trek The Next Generation magazine. And boy, I remember getting this on the newsstand and being just so utterly excited and keeping up with them, because then they would give episode synopsises for the entire series. They did it for 7 years. And I liked this initial one because it had an interview with Gene Roddenberry in here, and it whet our appetite what the show was going to be like going forward. And Gene says that time has passed and television has become freer, and it excites me to be able to explore things in a more relaxed way. I could talk about sex now in ways that we're never able to in the previous show. I want to talk about all types of sexuality. He wanted to talk about drug use. He wanted to talk about military. These are all things that he wanted to do in the original series that he could never do, but now he could do it in Next Generation. So if we look at this episode and just limit it to this episode, do we see certain things in here that we know Gene said, okay, we have to take it a step further from the original series? Anything that anyone noticed just in this encounter at Farpoint?
first encounter of, at least the first time I noticed the men in the dresses.
That's right. Yes.
It's the first time I ever know, and I don't know how long they carry that through, if it's still a thing. But I just remember it in the very beginning of the Next Generation, and after that, I guess it's a faded memory. I don't know if they stopped doing that or not. But that's the first time I saw that in Star Trek.
And beyond that, what was kind of interesting was you don't get the full extent of her story, but having that bit with Tasha kind of talking about her past was very interesting, because everything in the original series makes it seem like every planet in the Federation is basically a utopia of sorts. And so it was very interesting just to hear that there are places out there with people where it's not all, roses. So that in combination with, revealing some of the darker parts of, the darker steps that humanity took to get to where they are now, with like the militarized police and everything else. So it was really cool to see some of that insight, and I think those are some of the points that Gene must have really wanted to include in there.
It is an interesting point about how the Next Generation was different than the original, because the original series was a network show, and so they had to go by the network standards. The Next Generation was in syndication, and I think the reason they didn't get it to a network was really because they weren't able to sell it to a network. But Gene said, well, syndication, after the fact, he said, syndication is really the way to go, because because the original series flourished once it reached syndication. And you think they actually do have more freedom in syndication. They could do more with the stories. And even when I heard about, like, when Voyager and Enterprise, those shows were on a network, and the reason they weren't as good is because the network interfered with some of their scripts and so forth. Yeah. And I forgot to mention Deforest Kelly in this was pretty cool. I mean, I had no idea he was going to be on that, so it was great to see him in a cameo. And of course, looking back at it now, you know that it had Chief O'Brien, even though he didn't have a name back then. They didn't, he was just one of those background actors back then.
And looking at it now, I think it's Khan meaning, but it's not. He was at the Khan.
It was Khan.
Observation about the Khan.
Yeah.
Didn't they switch where the Khan and Ops were at some point?
Yes.
Because today, Khan is on the opposite side.
That's right.
Well, it used to be navigation, where Chekhov sat on the left, on our left. Yeah, that was navigation, and the other one was helm. Yeah. And then helm was Sulu.
Because Picard was defining Khan as stage left.
Yes.
Now it's stage right.
They did change them. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that set the standard too going forward. There was a template with this show. You had an actor from the previous series making an appearance as a transition. So with this one, it was Dr. McCoy. We know that in Deep Space Nine, it was Captain Picard. With Voyager, is there anyone in Voyager for the first episode? Quark. That's right. It was Quark. Yes. So it's a winning formula, and I love the fact that DeForest Kelly. It just shows you what a pro he is. He knew that Gene couldn't afford his standard fees, so he said he'd just get regular scale rate because he wanted to help out Gene. I mean, that's. Yep, I just don't think you have actors with that type of moral values of saying, I want to make the fans happy. I want to thank Gene for what he's done for me. Yeah, I'll cut back my scale just because it's the right thing to do.
They did cut corners on safety a little bit because you're not, union rules say you're not supposed to ride on forklifts. And in Farpoint Station, when Q comes into when he navigates about the courtroom, he's on a forklift.
Yeah. I like that scene.
It's a neat scene how they did that. But as a professional stagehand myself, it's hard to look at that and think, how'd they get away with that?
Well, kind of like on that same idea of effects, it's always funny to me looking at the whole event of the saucer separation. Because it's just kind of a weird idea in concept. Like I get it in the sense of you're basically separating the civilians from what's essentially the military here, but otherwise I'm not sure what advantage it brings, and I guess the writers had a hard time coming up with good advantages for it as well, since it pops up so little in the series.
Very little.
But I guess that's kind of their way of or just from most people, this show is about, the ship and the journey. And so this is their way of kind of including that, those beautiful views of the ship through the pilot here. Yeah.
And that was the big difference of having entire families on the ship. And we got to see that. We got to see families evacuating. So we're seeing, this is the long haul. The original series was a 5-year mission, and this is a continuing mission.
And that brings up, there were some ideas that Gene had for the original series that they just didn't have the budget for, like the saucer separation. He did have the idea back then, but they just couldn't show it. And I believe it was mentioned in the making of Star Trek that the saucer section is supposed to be able to separate. And the same thing with the holodeck too. He didn't have the budget to do a holodeck on the original series, but it showed up on the animated series because on a cartoon they can do anything, So they did do it. So yeah, there were those ideas that he had that now he finally can do, which was great. And the better technology in the 80s compared to the 60s, so they could do more with TV. They also made The Next Generation more of an ensemble cast.
Very much so.
With the original, it was more Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. You could tell they were the main characters. And for The Next Generation, they were kind of, you could still tell that Picard was the main character, but they spent a lot of time having an episode for each person so you could get to know them better. And it was just more of getting to know, like, you knew everybody a lot better than you did on the original. And of course, it lasted 7 seasons compared to the only 3 seasons and the movies for the original.
What did you think about John Delancey as Q? I believe that this is the only Star Trek series where the adversary that's introduced in the pilot episode becomes one of, if not the major adversary throughout the whole series. I mean, Q in itself is iconic. It's spread in the books. They've added to the lore in the novels. But the casting of John Delancey, I thought was absolutely perfect. They even worked the filming schedule around him because he was already working on a play, so they filmed all his scenes just at the end and then spliced them in order. What did everyone feel about Q?
I like John's acting. Can't say I've always liked his acting, but everybody comes from somewhere. He did very well in this role. Specifically in Farpoint, where he just played kind of the maniacal jerk out on a mission to condemn, in a sense, and then humanity proved him wrong. So he also played well on the whole moral role or the moral lesson.
Yes,
in a sense. So anytime you see Q shows up, there's going to be a moral lesson. There's always moral lessons in Star Trek, but anytime you see Q, you know there's going to be some sort of moral reason he's there, even if it's not him. But in the introduction, I thought that it was pretty well planned. They made him obviously omnipotent and timeless. They gave him a full rainbow of power where no one else has it, and it just kind of made it obvious that there was nothing that anyone on that ship could do on their own or collectively to oppose this Q, which was kind of neat. It's in a sense, I'm surprised you don't see Doctor Who on the show, but he's kind of like the Doctor. He shows up out of nowhere, no one knows who he is or what his purpose is or how he got there or what he can do. And, Q's sonic screwdriver's in his head.
Yeah.
So in a sense, he's kind of like, he is the bingo ball of the Star Trek show. If they need a character to pull off something that just doesn't make sense any other way, they can bring John in and Q. They can bring Q in and just make it happen. I would say he's plausible. He's the what do you call it? No, there's plausible deniability, and I guess there's plausible possibility. Maybe he's the plausible possibility because he can do everything.
Yeah, I think John Delancey was great in this. I mean, I wasn't familiar with him from any work prior to seeing the show, but like he's got a great ability to be menacing without being intimidating, if that makes sense. Like just from his delivery, that like he almost comes off as slightly unhinged, but that kind of adds to it because he's not, like, at least to me, he's not a very intimidating presence, but his delivery really sells it. And so I think seeing him in this and then kind of seeing what he becomes as the series progresses is really interesting, just because he comes off as omnipotent in this, but as the show continues, you kind of learn that as far as humanity is concerned and what we're capable of, he's maybe not so much.
He's the epitome of narcissism too.
Yeah,
which is something that I've noticed in that character.
Yeah. So I always love episodes with Q. I mean, one of my favorites is when he's punished by being turned human.
Just recently watched that.
So it's always good to see him, and I'm curious to see what they end up doing with him in this next season of Picard.
Q could have his own show. Can you imagine the universes and life forms?
You know what's interesting to note is that Q was not really in the original script for Encounter at Farpoint. He was a last-minute addition.
That's right.
Yeah. Right, because they just needed to make the episode longer. Gene Roddenberry added Q because they wanted a 2-hour episode for the premiere. They needed to make it a little longer, so he added Q. And that was actually one of the complaints of some of the fans, like, oh, another godlike character, because they had several on the original series. Mm-hmm. So, in that way, he wasn't original, but he still turned out to be a great character. It's just amazing the origin. Sometimes, something unintentional or unplanned in the beginning can really be a hit. I
can't imagine this episode without the Q story.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the writers, so Gene created Q basically to be Picard's adversary, and that was something the writers noticed too, that Q worked better with Picard. The next time we see him a few episodes later, he talks to Riker a little more. He gives Riker his powers and all, and somehow that didn't work as well in the story. And then like when Q was on Deep Space Nine. And the writers kind of didn't know what to do with him. I thought he was good on Deep Space Nine, but the reason he never came back was because the writers just said he didn't work as well with Commander Sisko. But he did work well with Janeway. That's why he kept going back to Voyager. But but like I said, I was a fan of John Delancey before Star Trek. So yeah, he was always a great actor. He was a great comedic actor. That's kind of what he was known for on Days of Our Lives. And you do see the comedy a lot in him, but he can do the menacing part so well too. He was just a great all-around actor and a great adversary for Picard. That's why it's so natural for him to come back to the Picard series, because he was always there to plod Picard along, to goad him along, and they worked well together. You know how many times Picard just yells Q, all of that. They were just a great pair. Oh, and it was mentioned too in a book. How many times have we seen Q and Picard in bed together? Twice in Cupid and in Tapestry.
Interesting.
Okay.
And so this episode brings up the progress of humanity. What have we learned? And in over 30 years, I think in so many ways we've gotten better. Humanity does grow. You know, we slip in some ways, but we grow in other ways. And when we look at Star Trek, that's the beautiful thing about Star Trek. It's introspective. We say, how can I better myself so I can better others, so I can better the world around me? Do we see any thoughts with regards to that, with regards to Picard's argument that, yes, humanity is getting better?
You know, today, in the world I live in, that you and I live in, and everybody listening lives in, it doesn't seem like humanity's gotten any better in the last decade. It seems like it's kind of chaotically bouncing around the pinball machine, in a sense, right now. But speaking of Star Trek, I think they point out a lot of really great points with the history of how we've evolved and how we've gone from just the really dumb stuff and learning from your mistakes is really what this points out. Is this particular episode points out the fact that, you know, they portray a society that has learned from their mistakes and have corrected their ways, even though we don't live in that today so much as it is in the episode. I love the how, you know, the basic needs of people are met in Star Trek. In that in the Star Trek universe, your basic needs are met. The economic system has completely evolved into something else, which is one of the.
But Beverly did say, "Charge it to my room." So
exactly.
This is one of the faux pas. There still is some kind of exchange currency credit system.
They keep the credits. They keep the credit, and it's only used for erroneous stuff like gambling and buying stuff like that. But they could just go to the ship's replicator and you know, get what they need. It's interesting to see the fact that they still keep an economic system in place, even though they don't really need it. But you also think from a universe standpoint, planets and species and other life forms, you know, they may not be there in that particular mode yet. You know, I don't know what the Klingons use for currency, but I'm sure there is. But it's neat to see how the possibility of us evolving past ourselves into something that's so much more functional and better from an overall perspective, like a world peace standpoint. So it's one of the things I love about Star Trek is they kind of portray the very concept of world peace, and they've designed it well by creating that evolution of all those things, meeting the people's basic needs and aiming for science, exploration, and education. So I love that, probably most of all.
I would say the interesting thing to me about the portrayal of humanity in the show has always been that, you know, yes, it is a society that, compared to like our current day, is very evolved in the way they treat each other and their economic systems and everything else. But the other thing that I really like about it is that it really shows that idea of evolving is not an idea where it has a set endpoint. Because even with all their advancements, they still have struggles that we find very relatable.
Yeah, they do well with making it a checkpoint.
Right.
In this sense.
And so what it kind of gives me hope from that is that, you know, if they're still evolving, then it's fine that we're still evolving. Because that's just kind of all we can do, is we can try to better ourselves as these people have been. So that's what I've always really enjoyed about it, is just that despite the differences in like in the tools that we might have, we're still both trying to better ourselves with struggles that either one of us could understand on some level.
So this episode did set up kind of what the series is going to be about, with Picard saying humanity is no longer barbaric like we used to be. And he's saying we are passionate, we're resolute, and we're advanced. You know, he knows that they're more evolved than the 21st century when they used to have the unfair trials. And that's what this show is about, the advancement of humanity. We're here to explore, and we've grown past our primitive days, and we're here to learn, and we're here to help. We know we will succeed in this because our intentions are good, our hearts are good, we're in the right place, and we're going to meet people and make friends. And of course, you have to make enemies, but we will always be strong and resolute in our beliefs. We'll never back down. And it almost sounds like hubris to say these things about humanity, but it's just, in this case, you could say it's just confidence. This is what he really believed, and it is what they showed in every episode of this.
And we can't be judged for our ancestors' actions. Picard said, yes, that happened in the past, but look at what we're doing now. We learned from mistakes. We are moving forward. And I think that's the best thing about the Next Generation, is it did take the Star Trek franchise, and this truly is the show that Gene wanted to portray. He could not tell the stories, all the stories that he wanted to in the original series. So this is an extension of Gene's dream.
Well, one of the things I want to encourage anybody that has trouble with Star Trek, I've encountered this a few times where somebody says to me, "Well, that'll never happen." World peace. Oh, that'll never happen. Our economy evolving. That'll never happen. All this stuff. Star Trek will not. Well, not with an optimistic attitude like that. It's not going to happen. But you take an idea of. Just take a look at the Star Trek framework and how that culture is built. Because he didn't just build a show; he built an entire culture. He redefined the Earth culture in a sense, and along with it, bringing in the possibilities of alien cultures that are both in front and behind us, and some alongside. So the whole idea of it being possible is really what it takes for change to make. If you believe it's possible and you just believe in what's possible, see the good things and aim for them, and so you see something that's possible that you might want to have in your life, don't let today's society define it for you.
Yeah, and I would say, that's just another thing that's great about this show, is it has so many messages that you could take away from it. And one that I always come back to is that idea of, sometimes you just should accept change and welcome it and embrace it, because that's how you grow. And we see it shown over and over again in the series, in all of the series, really. And so if that's something that you can take away as someone who watches the show, I think that you'll take away a lot from it.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long, and may the Force be with you. Nanu Nanu.